Okay, at this point, I think I need to ask who didn't 2016 kill?
Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude near the Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is curled up in my arms, purring contentedly. Yes, you are, aren't you, you little shitbag? Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. This episode's going to be a bit different than the usual news episode. What with it being the end of the year and all, most news outlets are focused on looking back at the year that was, as if things stop happening in the world because of an arbitrary calendar date. There are some news stories I want to touch on in a bit in this episode, but I need to do a little housekeeping before I get to that. The most important bit of news, and I'm sure you all want to hear about, is that Fuzznuts seems to be doing much better. The little shit managed to avoid taking some of his pills, but I did get most of them into him. I'll be taking him for a follow-up visit next weekend, and if everything checks out, he'll be fully vaccinated at that time. Next is that America will be returning to the podcast this month. She's slotted for 2 episodes, and given that she's almost as popular of a co-host as Fuzznuts, it'll be great to have her back. I also need to give a big thank you to Jonathan from the TDTF podcast for having me and Robert from the Secular Yakking podcast on his show for an impromptu post-New Year talk. I will have links to both those shows in the show notes. Additionally, Dustin from the Atheist Nomads podcast managed to find the complete file of our conversation, so we don't have to re-record it, which is good, because even though Dustin had read the Book of Judith before, he, like Lauren and I, were rather surprised by the ending of the work. It seems that Dustin had misremembered what happened, so in addition to Lauren and I going, "What the fuck?" throughout the book, you have Dustin going, "What the fuck?" when we got to the end. If we had to re-record that, those things would have been lost. I also want to give a nod to Matthew the Apostle over at the In the Name of God, the podcast, for mentioning the show. There's a bit of an inside joke as to why he mentioned me, which I'll explain now. It's also kind of long, so my apologies. In the Atheist Podcast group we're members of on Facebook, someone posted a link to a podcaster's award and asked some questions about it. Having listened to podcasts for about a decade now and been involved in podcasting in some form or another for most of that, the one thing that I've learned about all the awards is that almost all of them are some kind of scam. Some of them, if you get nominated, you have to pay to be considered for winning. I actually got an email from one of them saying that I'd been nominated, but I would need to pay $250 for my podcast to be voted on. Yeah, no thanks. Others of them charge you for your trophy and to go to the awards ceremony. Almost all of them rely on audience votes to pick a winner. So if you don't have an audience that's as large as, say, what many of the NPR podcasts have, which their downloads are in the tens of millions each week, it's pretty hard for you to get enough votes to win. I have noticed that what usually happens is that the first time someone gets nominated for such an award, they generally make a huge deal about it on their podcast, but even if they win, they never mention being nominated again. Some years ago, Leo Laporte on one of the Twit podcasts that he does went on a rant about how shitty the various podcast awards are. He was angry, and I think rightly so, that because his podcasts always got a nomination in their respective categories, the group that was giving out the awards changed their rules so that you could only be nominated so many times during the life of the podcast, regardless of how many times you actually won. Now, think about that. No matter how small your audience is, there's probably going to be at least one fan dedicated enough to nominate your podcast every year. They do it enough times, and even if you put out a hugely significant episode, like, say, the interview Kevin Pollak did with Robin Williams, you can't be nominated because you've been nominated too many times in the past. Mind you, it's not only podcast awards that are bogus, but even the Oscars are to a large extent. Pick a year at least a decade or more ago because you want your memories of that year to be somewhat hazy. Then look up the movies that were released that year. After you've done that, compare it to the list of movies which won Oscars. Generally, what you'll find is that the films you most remember from that year were probably not big winners at the Oscars. And the films that were big winners are ones you'll look at and think, what the fuck were they thinking? Citizen Kane is widely considered to be one of the most important movies of all time. It revolutionized storytelling, cinematography, and film techniques such as editing. Yet the only Oscar it got was for Best Original Screenplay. So to go back to my initial point, when the person in the group asked about the awards, I asked, do they have an award for the best use of the word Belgium in a podcast? Which is a reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide series where Arthur Dent infuriates an actor for not congratulating him on winning an award for using the word Belgium in a movie. Belgium, you see, is a word so obscene that every planet in the galaxy has banned it, except for the Earth. And that's why Matthew name-dropped me and mentioned Belgium on his show. Oh, and all that is why you'll never hear me asking people to nominate or to vote for the show for a podcast award. If I'm going to ask my listeners to do something, I'm going to try to pick something that has significance beyond the show. As I said at the beginning, the news sites are all focused on looking back, and that makes it kind of hard to find stories to cover, other than the endless discussion of what kind of involvement the Russians had in the past election. I think that it's safe to say Trump is unlikely to do much about the Russians, seeing as how he's such a huge fan of Putin. There's some interesting twists with all that, however, as not only have the Russians been caught infecting a computer belonging to an electrical utility in Vermont, but a supposedly former advisor to Trump, Carter Page, who announced Trump's pick for Secretary of State before Trump did, has sent a letter to Senator John McCain telling him that if the U.S. continues to investigate Russian involvement in the election, the lives of American military personnel could be at risk. That tidbit, by the way, comes from an official Russian news source, not some lefty publication which is interpreting things to put people connected with Trump in the worst possible light.
Any efforts by members of Congress now to undercut potential new approaches to Russia would risk U.S. national security and innumerable service members' lives,
is a direct quote from the letter sent to McCain. The letter goes on to cite numerous proxy wars the U.S. and Russia are involved in, and strongly implies that if we don't play nice with Russia, they'll all get worse. Do I have to point out that when Obama was caught on tape telling the former Russian prime minister that after the 2012 election, Obama would have more room to maneuver in regards to not deploying anti-missile systems in Poland, or that the Republicans absolutely lost their shit over it? You know, because the Russians were still an evil empire built on world domination. But now that the Russians have gotten Trump elected, or at least seem to have been the ones who got him elected, they're actually a bunch of all-right guys. That's a bit of an oversimplification, of course, because some Republicans, like John McCain and Orrin Hatch, if you can believe it, are saying that we need to punish Russia for their actions. Still, lots of Republicans are more than happy to let the matter drop, including Trump, who claims that he'll be revealing new information which proves the Russians didn't hack the election on either Tuesday or Wednesday. The one other really interesting tidbit that I found in the news was in the Washington Post. We've all heard about Trump's belligerent attitude towards China over things like trade. This seemed a bit odd to me because lots of Trump-branded clothing is made in China. Pissing off the Chinese seems like a good way to lose your biggest supplier of crap. Not to mention that a lot of investors in Trump's companies all come from either China or other parts of Asia and Russia. They pull out, or even just some of them pull out, and Trump's empire collapses. However, as the Washington Post points out, Trump has been desperately trying to build a hotel in China for years now. The reasons given by the article as to why this hasn't happened boil down to that there's a soft market for luxury hotels in China right now, and the Trump brand isn't well known there, so the communist government sees no reason to approve Trump building one. The people interviewed in the article seem to think that Trump's plan is to use the presidency to schmooze his way into getting the Chinese to allowing him to build hotels there. Do you really think that a guy whose motto is grab them by the pussy wants to schmooze? No, he intends to use the full might of the U.S. government to browbeat the Chinese into letting him build a hotel in their country. He'll take us to the brink of war in order to get it, I'm sure. And the only reason why it won't turn into a full-scale war is because the Chinese aren't stupid and will blink rather than risking everything to save face. Trump won't care what effect this has on the rest of the country because his wealth and his position of power will insulate him from the consequences of his actions. The rest of us, however, will not be so lucky. A trade war with China won't just mean that we can't get new iPhones at the current price. While we don't make electronics in this country anymore, we do make a number of other things that we export to the rest of the world. My own employer, for example, surprisingly enough, we ship a lot of stuff to China. It's cheap. It's inexpensively made. I won't call it cheap because it's not cheaply made. We make a specialized kind of eye shield for surgeons that we export to China. I've no doubt that the Chinese will slash the prices of things they produce that they ship to other countries in order to get the rest of the world to buy their items instead of American-made ones. Sure, an American-made item might have better quality than a Chinese-made one, but if the price is so low that the item is effectively disposable, who cares? I mean, if an American-made refrigerator, and yes, we still do build a few of them here, sells for $500 and a Chinese-made one of similar size sells for $50, are you going to care if the Chinese one dies after a year? Probably not. This will have the effect of squeezing American goods out of foreign markets. Oops. Even after the Chinese relent and give Trump what he wants, it's unlikely that foreign sales of U.S.-made goods will be able to recover to their previous levels. Lest that seems crazy to you, that is one of the ways the Japanese gained a foothold in the American market. They sold items at a price so low they were disposable. Eventually, they caught up and surpassed American-made goods in terms of quality, all while being lower cost, if only slightly. But again, Trump and those around him aren't going to care about such things as they are insulated by their wealth from the effects of this. If the public gets angry about it, then Trump will go all jingly keys and start talking about Mexicans taking our jobs or some other nonsense. That creates a couple of problems for us in the sane side of the equation. We know that Trump attacking immigration is just a red herring, but if we don't divert resources to fighting against that, then potentially millions of innocent people could suffer. All the while, Trump and his cronies continue to destroy the American economy for personal gain. I hate to be all negative here, but at the same time, I remember thinking at about this point in 2001 that while Bush would probably get us into a war with Iraq, it'd be another 30-day or so affair and then it'd all be over. It never occurred to me that he'd ignore a critical intelligence briefing warning him that bin Laden was plotting something or that the war in Iraq would last over a decade. So now we have a president-elect who skips most of his intelligence briefings and by all accounts isn't interested in anything which doesn't directly involve him. How can this not be a recipe for disaster even if you ignore the other crap? I don't know. I do know that anyone pushing worst-case scenarios for Trump sounds like a bit of a lunatic. You know, because all of us don't want to really look at the possibility of what might be a shrieking horror actually happening in our lifetime. in the same way that people will talk about the biblical flood as being a good thing, without any consideration of the fact that were the myth to be true, God would have wiped out tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, just because he didn't like them. But let's try and think about this realistically for a moment. When we say Trump will wipe out the economy, what does that mean? If it's as bad as it was in 2008 when the economy collapsed, that means portions of the U.S. will have unemployment rates as high as 25%. Food banks will have trouble keeping food on the shelves because demand for it will be so high. Incomes will plummet for even those able to keep their jobs. Homelessness will increase. The number of people living below the poverty level, and technically I live above the poverty level, so that number's bullshit, will increase. Now, let's add in the fact that Trump and his cronies want to do away with things like Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, the minimum wage, and various government regulations. How can an economic collapse under those circumstances not be worse than what it was in 2008? I got laid off in November of that year, and it took me 4 months to find a crappy-ass job at Wally World. I took it because it paid $20 a week more than unemployment, and it got me out of the house. I should point out that my unemployment check after taxes, because yes, they tax your unemployment, was $256 a week. You want to try living on that? If Trump wrecks the economy, which seems almost a certainty, how are the millions of Americans like me going to survive? Because let's face it, the solutions Trump will offer will probably be things like more tax cuts for the wealthy and large corporations, cutting government regulations because companies just can't afford to hire more people if they have to worry about getting dioxin out of the water, blaming immigrants for our problems, and anything and everything he can think of other than solutions to the actual cause of our problems. The jingly keys of immigrants taking our job will work for a little while, but he'll need more than that. So we'll probably see increased claims about China's unfair trade practices, Gao turning his back on us because of things like gay rights and abortions. Also tirades about how this is all some kind of Muslim plot to destabilize our country, and who knows what else. We'll probably pick a fight with some third world country that can't defend itself and bomb the shit out of them just so people have something to chant USA, USA, USA about. It's not a pretty picture. And I'll admit that it's certainly not 100% accurate. I mean, like I said, oh yeah, in 2001, Bush will get us involved in a war in Iraq. Never occurred to me that he would do this via bin Laden attacking the World Trade Center. So, we'll see some of these elements, I think, but there will be other elements, potentially larger elements, that have as big, if not a bigger impact on our country and the world than what I've discussed, which is scary. And it also kind of makes me sound like Jim Baker and his crazy food bucket bullshit. But, why buy a food bucket when you know that if the economy collapses, you're not going to have a place to put your bucket? I mean, let's be realistic here. The economy implodes, I'm going to be homeless. If I still have my current job, that won't be so bad because there's an abandoned barn just a few feet away from the plant, so Fuzznuts and I can live in there, and I can use their Wi-Fi to upload the podcast. I'm not kidding about this. I've put some thought into it. I mean, and there's probably somebody saying, well, just save a little extra each month or out of each check. Saving out of each check isn't really a practical thing for me. I'm lucky if I have anything by the time my next check hits the bank. And I'm sure some people are probably asking, well, why go to ReasonCon? That's got to be expensive. Well, it is a modest expense. I mean, thankfully, I've got people helping me with that. But the truth is, I need for psychological reasons to go to things like ReasonCon. I mean, I'm relatively isolated here. Partially because I don't have a car, so I can't go out and meet people and hang out with them, but also because, I live in a trailer park. I'm an atheist. And I live in a state that doesn't value education. It's not easy for me to find people that I can relate to and can have a conversation with. I mean, I know lots of them. They all live in Nashville. And, it's an hour's drive almost for them to come here to see me. And there's limited things that we can do here in town. And, well, the thing that if you're ever somebody who is really socially isolated, if you're aware of everything, you will notice that it's pretty easy to get trapped into behaviors that are self-destructive. Your brain on, the lizard level or some basic level is trying to short things out because it knows that you're not doing pro-survival things, but because, our brains evolved way before we had anything like housing, central heat and air, et cetera, et cetera. You don't do it effectively. Your brain is thinking too, is basically at that lizard level it's got two options. Throw shit up against the wall and see what sticks, or throw something up at the wall that'll just cause you to take yourself out before you can contaminate the gene pool. Now, I'm not suicidal or anything like that, but, I know if I stay just in this house and don't get out and do things, go somewhere that I've not been in a long time, travel a long distance, I will eventually end up like an animal in a trap and start gnawing my own legs off, and that's not good. That's metaphorically gnawing my legs off. So I need to go to things like that. Plus, it's a good way to network and I will meet people there. They will find out I'm a podcaster. They will download the show. Hopefully they'll like it. I'll get a bigger audience, more Patreon supporters and things like that. Plus, by encountering people like that, I can make, other connections, not necessarily related to the podcast. When we were there 2 years ago, we met a bunch of people who were from Tennessee, from our area. Cass, who does the Everybody's Agnostic podcast, he lives, He lives about 45 minutes from where I do. We didn't know him. We'd never heard of his podcast or anything like that till we met him there. We might meet somebody there that, has a connection here who can get me a better job, or, says, hey, look, you move out to this part of the country and, we can get you a job right here in our company, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I have friends who pretty much all over the country. If I can afford to pack up and move, I could hang out with, they'd let me crash with them until I got on my feet. But that's kind of a risky thing to do if you're not certain that you've got an outlet for employment, especially when you have no savings. And hell, it may be the last time I get to go to something like Reason Con. We don't know what the future will hold. And it may be that in 2018 they don't hold a Reason Con, or they do, and I have absolutely no way of getting there or being able to afford it or anything like that. I don't know. Nobody knows. But I have a chance to go now, and I'm going to take it. And no matter what your circumstances are, if you can get to an atheist convention, as I've said before, go, 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 go. You will not regret it. And I don't mean to make everything sound so bleak. There's, actually some positives. As hard as that may be to believe. Yes, Fuzznuts, I know you want attention. Come here, buddy. Unlike the mindless idiots who, voted for Trump and chanted, make America great again! Lock her up! Lock her up! We're not laboring under the false impression that things are going to be wonderful under Trump, that he's going to do all these magical things. We know he's not. We know he can't, even if he wanted to do them. I mean, his talk of opening the coal mines, as I've said before, That's bullshit. Because according to friends of mine who work in the power generation industry, lots and lots of coal-fired plants have now switched over to natural gas because natural gas is so much cheaper than coal. So reopening the mines won't do you any good because there's no customers for the coal. Now, of course, obviously they can cut the labor costs and things like that and, basically use slave labor, to mine the coal. But still, that's not a great thing when you realize that, for those plants to convert back to using coal, they'll have to shell out lots and lots of money. And according to a couple of different sites I've seen, the cost of solar power has now fallen below that of fossil fuel power, which means power companies, if they're going to be looking at laying out large sums of money, are probably going to be looking more towards solar than they are coal. They will still have to use natural gas because obviously you can't have solar power work at night. I mean, there's ways around that, but those aren't yet common enough and nobody's really pushing them for them to be an effective solution. The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe a week or two ago had a great discussion on ways of storing solar power, to use during times when the sun wasn't shining. But, whether or not they'll do those and things like that is another story. But still, you're not going to be able to bring the demand for coal back in this country. And even China is getting away from coal as best they can. Because, well, if you haven't seen the pictures of Beijing, it's bad. It's like the old London fog. You can't see shit. And if we're smart, during this time when, Trump is in his honeymoon period with his base before things start to go sour, if during that time we organize ourselves, we get things in place, we have, not only organizations for political action, but support organizations to help people who are going to be in need, which they are, then when his base realizes they've been had, there will immediately be people they can latch onto, namely us, and they won't spontaneously form their own organizations, which will be, probably like the Tea Party or worse. If we have groups that are dedicated to just causes, and we tailor the arguments behind those groups correctly, we'll be able to suck all those people, or most of them rather. I mean, the hardcore racists won't join in, but you'll be able to suck most of them in to our side. And we can begin the long process of rebuilding a decent society. But we have to have everything planned out. Because, even if we get Congress to be overwhelmingly Democratic in 2018, which is not going to happen, barring the miracle. And we all know how likely miracles are. Shh, that's not you distracting me, buddy. But if we, we're not going to be able to solve the problems. Even if we get a Democratic president or a Green Party president in the White House in 2020, and they've got an overwhelmingly democratically controlled Congress, you're still not going to solve the problems, because fundamentally the problems boil down to education, and not merely, well, we don't give people the right training so they can get a job. We don't teach critical thinking in the schools. That has to be a priority for us. We have to get critical thinking taught everywhere we possibly can, because if people are taught to think critically, then it's harder for guys like Trump to roll along in the future and do what he's done. Because one of the reasons why we're in this mess is we've undercut education in this country for decades. I mean, I went to a very poor school in the middle of Ohio, and we rode school buses that the floorboards were rotted out in spots, and you could actually see the road underneath them. And we rode those for years because the school district didn't have the money to replace them. And as I said in my episode entitled Hillary and the Working Class, large segments of our population do not value education. And you're not going to get them necessarily to go to school. So we have to find ways to ensure that, the children growing up in this country are educated, because if they're intelligent and they've been taught critical thinking skills, they're less likely to undo the repairs that we're going to be attempting here in the coming future. And there are some things we need to remember at this time. One is, when you're going after Trump, don't use a direct attack. Calling him Cheeto or doing the whole thing about him and the Russians. It's important to remember that. It's important to have that handy. Both of them. But it's not going to have necessarily the most success, because that's all in the media. Everybody sees it. They're built their defenses for it now. So they can they're prepared for anything you throw at them from that angle. Whether it be disregarding your news source or saying, well, there's extenuating circumstances or whatever. You have to find ways of going after them that catch people off guard. Because that's when you make inroads. And you have to do it in a manner that's not overly aggressive, which is very hard to do. And the simple truth of the matter is, the reason Donald Trump is president is because the American population are a bunch of idiots. I mean, there's other factors involved, of course, but as I've said in the past, no rational society would ever nominate him to be the head of be the candidate for a major political party. Obviously, if we have, we're not rational. No rational country would elect him as president. We did. Obviously, we're not rational. Now, of course, I know that Hillary won the popular vote by 3 million votes. But, nobody should have voted for Trump. No rational human being should have voted for Trump. So, clearly, there are over 60 million Americans who are not rational. And I would include people as not being rational as the ones who didn't vote. Because if you're eligible to vote and you didn't vote in what is obviously the most important election in 70 years or more, you're not really thinking. And that's not to say I think Hillary would have been the greatest president ever, or that she would have solved all our problems. She couldn't, just because the Republicans would block everything she tried to do, and she's flawed like every other human being, so she would do things that weren't in the country's best interest, even though she thought they were. But at least she would have had the country's best interests in mind, whereas Trump just has whatever goes through his head at any given moment on his mind. Still, if we organize, if we get our shit together faster than the other groups, we have a chance to succeed. So, and that's another reason why, you should get involved with your local political party and go to atheist conventions that you can, because you'll meet people, you'll get ideas from one another. And that's probably the biggest thing is not going there and listening to somebody give a talk about something. It's the conversations you have with people over dinner, in the hallway, just hanging out with one another. Your conversations are natural. They go in all different directions, and everybody feeds off of everything, and they all get new ideas. It's like sex versus masturbation. Staying home, doing nothing, masturbation. Going out and interacting with people, that's sex. And reach out, like, as I've said in the past, reach out to, various aid organizations in your area that, the charitable organizations that help people. Reach out to atheist organizations, reach out to LGBT groups, reach out to women's rights and women's health groups, and reach out to science organizations. They're all going to need help. And if we have that network started now, we are going to be in a much, much better position when things hit the fan, because they will hit the fan. We don't know how, but we know what's happened in the past when we've had somebody who says he wants to gut regulation, who wants to get rid of things like Social Security and the other elements of the safety net. We've had problems. Now, it took years in some cases for those problems to develop. I mean, the Great Recession was caused in part, not entirely, in part by the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act under the Clinton administration. But other elements in the during the Bush administration led to the crash as well. And, we don't know how Trump is going to react when there's a terrorist attack on something involving him or the U.S. We don't know how he'll react. He may just decide to nuke somebody, he may not. But, we have to be prepared for that contingency, because it's an NFL. It's going to happen because, guys, the terrorists, that's what they live for. They're trolls in the real world. They poke at something to get a big reaction out of it. That's their winning. And so we need to figure out how to stop Trump, how to blunt him. And we can only do that if we're together and organized. We need to figure out how to blunt Trump's abilities, at least in terms of the damage that he's going to be able to do. And we can only do that if we get together, if we organize. So please, as I'm just kind of a broken record here on this, I apologize. Get out there, meet with people, be active in atheist groups. Start one in your community if there's not one. I need to take my own advice on that. Do what you can, but make sure you have lots of connections to people. They will be not only avenues for action, but you will provide safety nets for one another when things go wrong. And that's really important, that you have a broad safety net. Okay, just a little bit more, and then I'm going to have to get out of here so I can get this posted and get to bed. I don't have to work tomorrow, but I do need to kind of get myself back on that sleep schedule after I was up so late most nights this past weekend. One thing I want to mention is I'm having issues with Facebook, not just the ones I ranted about in the episode I put out after Houdini died. I either have somebody out there who is, being a Christian justice warrior and reporting my posts to Facebook, or Facebook is mad because I'm not buying advertising from them. I don't have the money to buy advertising from them, so I don't. I mean, it really actually doesn't work all that well from what I've been able to gather. So, I'm not inclined to spend any money on it. Especially considering how little they know about me and how inaccurate their shit is towards me. It doesn't seem worth it to pay them, because it's like, wow, I'm giving you money to annoy people who don't want to see my shit. So, but anyways, what's been happening is when I post an episode to Facebook, it starts screaming about spam. And, you know, when I first post the episode up, they give you little tips. And, you know, the kinds of tips you get vary with how many likes your page has. And they're usually useless. But now the only tips I'm getting are, create a reminder to boost this post for just $5 and let 900 people see it. It's not a lot of people. 99.99% won't bother following through and listening to the podcast or subscribing. So, not really interested in spending $5, which I could better use on things around the house, or feeding me, or feeding Fuzznuts on those things. And, you know, at the time that started happening, ever since then, I've been getting notices. We think your post might be spam. Please tell us it's not spam if you posted this. It's like, yes, I posted it. You know. So they're trying to squeeze me out, I think, because I won't give them any money, because I don't have any money to give them. Which tells me they're desperate for cash, because there's been some announcements where they've had to revise downward the engagement levels that they've been telling advertisers they've been getting. And they've been doing screwy crap, changing things around, obviously trying to increase engagement, but without giving, you know, individuals things that they want to keep them engaged. Like, they're now, it's getting harder and harder to pull yourself out of groups that people add you to that you don't want to be involved in. And Facebook does this because it artificially inflates the group numbers. You know, you can say you've got 10,000 people in a group, and that's a good thing to sell to an advertiser about buying ads in that particular group. But what you don't tell them is that only 100 or less people are actually active in that group. The others have just been added to it because they get, you know, somebody thought they would like being in that group. Assuming there's not an evil plot, which may be by Facebook to pretend that somebody on your friends list added you to a group when they really didn't. I don't know. But I do know I'm having a lot of problems with it. So if you follow the podcast via Facebook, you're probably going to want to find a different method of getting it, like, you know, from the Libsyn page via iTunes, Stitcher, or a podcasting app, because I'm not going to put up, I don't have the money to pay them for ad dollars, and, you know, they start clamping down and be dicks about it. Well, I don't have the time to fight them over that shit. Because, you know, you have to jump through hoops, and you send them a message and it takes them a week to respond with this vague jargon-laden thing that is almost completely incomprehensible unless you actually work for Facebook and know what all their jargon means. So that's an issue. I do want to thank all the Patreon subscribers, and if you haven't downloaded the latest Patreon-only episode, you want to give it a listen here real soon. I want to thank everybody who helped and donated so I could get Fuzznuts to the vet. I really appreciate that. And he probably appreciates it, even though he doesn't realize that going to see the strange man who stuck the thing up his butt was in his best interest. So, other than that, I am going to get out of here so I can get this thing edited and posted. And next week will be Dustin and Lauren from the Atheist Nomads podcast doing more of the Book of Judith. And then the week after that, America will be back. Yay!
That's it for this episode of the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzznuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.